This contract has a problem. Daniel Carter looked up from his desk as Annie stood in the doorway, holding the contract carefully in both hands. What problem? Daniel asked, calm and patient. Annie, I read that contract very carefully before I signed it. My legal team read it. My finance team read it. And I read every page myself. I didn't see any mistakes in that contract. Annie walked to the desk and placed the contract down, then opened it and turned the pages until she found the section she was looking for. I think Clause 17 was changed, she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. No. I went through Clause 17 myself. I remember that section. It was about liability after the merger. Everything looked standard. There was nothing wrong with it. Annie gently turned the contract toward him and pointed to the paragraph. Yesterday it didn't say this, she said. Daniel looked at her. What do you mean yesterday? Yesterday evening, Annie said. I was waiting for my mom in the copy room. Your secretary brought a blue folder with this contract inside. She put it on the table and left for a phone call. I know I'm not supposed to read things. But I was curious, so I read Clause 17 because it had a lot of numbers and big words. Daniel didn't interrupt. He just watched her finger resting on the page. Yesterday, Clause 17 said both companies share the liability if something goes wrong, Annie continued. It said both sides were responsible. I remember the sentence because it said, both parties share equal responsibility. But this one, she tapped the paper. This one says your company accepts all responsibility. It says only your company pays if something goes wrong. Daniel frowned and read the paragraph again, slower now. That's not a small difference, he said quietly. Annie shook her head. No, sir. It's a very big difference. Yesterday it was shared. Today it's only you. That means this paper is not the same paper. Daniel crossed his arms, thinking. I read this before I signed it, he said again. But this time his voice was lower, less certain. I'm very careful with contracts. Annie nodded. I think you did read it carefully, sir, but I think someone changed only one part, so when you looked quickly, everything looked the same. Daniel looked at her again, studying her face, trying to understand how a child could stand in his office and talk about liability clauses like that. Even if what you're saying is true, he said, we would need proof. I can't accuse people because of a memory. Annie nodded quickly. There is proof, sir. The camera. Daniel blinked. Camera? In the copy room, Annie said. There's a camera in the top corner. If you check the camera from yesterday evening, you will see your secretary bring the contract in the blue folder. She put it on the table, and when she thought no one was looking, she opened the contract and looked at Clause 17. Daniel's expression changed. You saw that? Annie nodded. Yes, sir. She opened to that page and she was reading that part. She even said Clause 17 very quietly, like she was talking to herself. The camera should see her open that page. Daniel said nothing for a long moment. If the camera shows what you're saying, he said slowly, then someone changed the contract after legal approved it, and before I signed it. Annie nodded again. Yes, sir. That's why I came to tell you. Because if you take this contract to the meeting tomorrow, they will use this paper, not the old one. Daniel walked to the window and looked out over the city for a few seconds, thinking. When he turned back, his face looked different now. Not confused, not polite. The board meeting is tomorrow morning, he said. The other company will be there. Their lawyers will be there. Everyone will expect the signed contract. Annie was quiet, then she said carefully, You can still go to the meeting, sir. Daniel looked at her. Go to the meeting with this contract? Annie shook her head. No, sir. You go to the meeting and say your assistant is preparing the final document, and will bring it later. You don't give them this contract yet. Daniel stared at her, listening. And tonight, Annie continued, you check the camera, and you ask someone you trust to compare yesterday's contract and today's contract. If Clause 17 is different, then you have proof someone changed it. Then you don't just lose your company. You can show everyone what they tried to do. Daniel looked down at the contract again, then back at Annie. You're telling me, he said slowly, that I should walk into that meeting tomorrow, pretend everything is normal, delay giving them the contract, and use that time to investigate and collect evidence. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. My teacher says if someone sets a trap for you, the best way to win is not to step in it. It's to show everyone where the trap is. For a long moment, Daniel Carter said nothing. Then he looked at Clause 17 again, at the words that now looked like a knife hidden inside a paragraph. Daniel Carter did not sleep that night. The contract lay on his desk, Clause 17 marked with a small yellow note. He had read it at least 20 times. And every time he read it, the sentence looked more dangerous. Not less. Assumes all post-merger liabilities, past, present, and undisclosed. And now, one paragraph could erase all of it. At 6:30 a.m., Daniel was already in his office. The building was quiet, the early light turning the glass walls pale gold. On his desk were three things: the signed contract, a legal pad filled with notes, and a phone with a paused security video on the screen. The head of security, Martin Lopez, stood across from the desk, arms folded. "I pulled the footage from the copy room like you asked," Martin said. "This is from yesterday evening. Around 7:12 p.m. Daniel pressed play again. The black and white footage showed the copy room from the top corner angle. A few seconds passed, then the door opened and his executive secretary, Linda Harper, walked in carrying a blue folder. She placed the folder on the table, checked her phone, then opened the folder and pulled out the contract. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. Linda flipped through the pages, then stopped. She looked around once, like people do when they think no one is paying attention. Then she bent slightly over the document, clearly reading one specific page. Clause 17. Even without sound, Daniel could see her lips moving slightly, like she was reading or whispering the words to herself. Then she pulled a pen from her pocket, made a small mark on the page, closed the contract, and put it back into the blue folder just before the phone at her ear rang again. She picked it up and walked out of the room with the folder. The video ended. Martin looked at Daniel. "You want me to run the footage from later that night too?" "Yes," Daniel said quietly. Martin tapped the screen and brought up another clip. 9:03 p.m. The copy room again. Linda entered with the same blue folder. This time she went straight to the table, opened the contract, and flipped to the same section again. Clause 17. She took out a different pen this time, uncapped it, and leaned over the document longer. Her body blocked part of the page from the camera, but her hand moved slowly across the paper, line by line. Then she capped the pen, closed the folder, and left the room. The video went black. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. "She was alone both times," Martin said. "No one else entered the copy room in between those timestamps." Daniel nodded slowly. "Get me the access log for the printers and document system. I want to know if any version of the merger contract was printed after legal approved the final draft." Martin nodded. "You think she changed the document herself?" "I think," Daniel said, looking back at the frozen image of Linda Harper on the screen, "that she knew exactly what Clause 17 said. Yesterday. And last night." Martin hesitated. "You want me to bring this to the police?" Daniel shook his head immediately. "Not yet. If this is what I think it is, she's not doing it alone. And if we move too early, whoever is behind this will bury the evidence before we can prove anything." Martin nodded once. "So what's the plan?" Daniel looked at the contract on his desk, then at the time on his watch. 7:10 a.m. "The board meeting is at 9, he said. "Reed Capital and their lawyers will be there. They'll expect me to walk in with this contract and celebrate." He closed the folder slowly. "I'm going to the meeting," he said. "But I'm not giving them this contract." Martin raised an eyebrow. "What are you going to tell them?" Daniel allowed himself a thin smile. "That my assistant is preparing the final signature copies and will bring them up later. It's a $1 billion deal. No one will question a delay of an hour." "And during that hour?" Martin asked. Daniel tapped the security tablet with the paused footage. "During that hour, I want copies of yesterday's printed version, today's printed version, and the printer logs. I want IT to check document version history. Quietly. No emails. No internal memos. You talk to people in person only." Martin nodded. "You trust it?" "I trust 2 people in IT, Daniel said. "I'll tell you which 2. He paused, then added, "And Martin, not a word about Annie." "The little girl?" Martin asked. Daniel nodded. "If someone inside this company is willing to rewrite a liability clause in a merger contract, I don't want them knowing that a child saw it first. That makes her a problem, and problems get removed." This story reminds us that the most dangerous traps in life don't always look like traps. Sometimes, they look like opportunities, contracts, and friendly smiles across a conference table. It also reminds us that wisdom doesn't always come from powerful people in expensive suits. Sometimes, the person who sees the truth the clearest is the one nobody is paying attention to. And in the end, this story is not just about a contract or a business deal. It is about courage, the courage to speak up, the courage to do the right thing, and the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Martin's expression hardened slightly. Understood. After Martin left, Daniel sat alone in his office again. At 8:40 a.m., there was a soft knock on his open door. Daniel looked up. Annie stood there, her backpack on, her hair neatly tied, her mother just behind her in her cleaning uniform. "Good morning, sir," Annie said politely. "Good morning, Annie," Daniel said. "Come in for a minute." Her mother looked nervous immediately. "Sir, I'm sorry if she caused any trouble last night. She knows she's not supposed to." "It's all right," Daniel said gently. "She didn't cause trouble. She may have prevented a very big one." Annie stepped into the office. "Are you going to the meeting?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "Are you taking the contract?" she asked. Daniel shook his head slightly. "No, I'm going to do exactly what you said. I'm going to tell them the final copies are being prepared and will be delivered later. That will give me time." Annie nodded, like this was simply the next logical step in a math problem. "And the camera?" she asked. "I checked it," Daniel said. "You were right. The camera saw my secretary in the copy room, twice, looking at clause 17. Annie was quiet for a moment. "Then you have proof someone touched the contract." "I have proof someone looked at that page very carefully," Daniel said. "Now I need proof that the page was changed." Annie thought for a moment, then said, "If the printer prints tiny yellow dots on paper, you can see when each page was printed. My teacher showed us that in class once." Daniel stared at her. "Yellow dots?" She nodded. "They're very tiny. You need a special light to see them. They show the time and which printer printed the page. If clause 17 was printed at a different time than the rest, then that page is not from the same contract." Daniel studying her like she was the most unexpected business partner he had ever had. "Annie," he said quietly, "how do you know all this?" She shrugged a little. "I read a lot, and I listen when adults think no one important is listening." Daniel looked at the clock again. 8:52 a.m. Time to go to war, he thought. He stood, picked up his suit jacket, and took the contract folder in his hand, but not to bring it to the meeting, only to lock it in his desk drawer. Before he left, he looked down at Annie. "You and your mom," he said, "stay together today. And if anyone asks you questions about last night, you don't tell them anything. You just tell them to talk to me." Annie nodded. "Yes, sir." Daniel walked to the door, then paused and looked back at her. "Annie," he said, "last night you told me that if someone sets a trap, the best way to win is to show everyone where the trap is." Annie nodded again. Daniel gave a small, grim smile. "Today, we find the trap, and then we show it to the whole room." The boardroom on the 31st floor was designed to make people feel small. The table alone could seat 20, made of dark, polished wood that reflected the ceiling lights like still water. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the room, showing the entire Chicago skyline, as if the city itself had been invited to witness whatever decisions were made in this room. Daniel Carter walked in at exactly 9 a.m., calm, composed, wearing the same expression he used when negotiating deals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Around the table sat the executives from Reed Capital, their lawyers, 2 members of Daniel's board, and at the far end, Michael Reed himself, silver hair, expensive suit, the relaxed posture of a man who believed this meeting was already a victory. "Daniel," Reed said, standing and smiling as they shook hands. Big day, Daniel agreed. They sat. Coffee was poured. Assistants moved quietly around the edges of the room, placing folders, tablets, and glasses of water in front of each person. Reed glanced at the empty space in front of Daniel. "I assume you brought the signed agreement." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He opened a folder in front of him, glanced at a few pages as if reviewing notes, then looked up. "My assistant is preparing the final signature copies," he said smoothly. "There were a few formatting corrections we wanted to clean up, so the archived version is perfect. She'll bring the contract up shortly." Reed waved a hand casually. "Of course, details matter." But one of Reed's lawyers, a thin man with sharp eyes, looked at Daniel for a second longer than necessary. Daniel noticed. Good, he thought. Be suspicious. That means you care. The meeting began with the usual presentations, market projections, integration timelines, expected returns. Slides appeared on the large screen. Numbers, charts, confident voices explaining why this merger was brilliant, strategic, inevitable. Daniel spoke when he needed to, nodded when appropriate, asked a few questions. On the outside, he looked like a man finalizing the biggest deal of the year. On the inside, he was counting minutes. At 9:17 a.m., his phone vibrated once in his pocket. Martin. Daniel didn't check the phone immediately. He waited until one of the Reed Capital analysts started a long explanation about projected infrastructure savings. Then he glanced down at the screen under the table. Printer logs confirmed. Clause 17 page, printed separately. 8:42 p.m., different printer. Daniel's pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Years ago, he had learned that the moment the truth appears is the moment you must become the calmest person in the room. He typed one message back. Get it in writing, quietly. He put the phone away and looked up at the screen again. But he wasn't seeing the charts anymore. He was seeing the copy room. The blue folder. Linda Harper, leaning over the contract. A single page printed separately, hours after the final version had supposedly been completed. At 9:26 a.m., Reed leaned back in his chair and smiled. Well, unless anyone has concerns, I think we're ready to finalize. Once the signed agreement arrives, we can make this official. Daniel folded his hands on the table. Actually, he said calmly, there is one thing I'd like to review together before we sign anything in this room. Reed's smile didn't disappear, but it changed slightly. Oh, yes, Daniel said. Clause 17, liability assignment post-merger. One of Reed's lawyers spoke immediately. That clause was negotiated and finalized last week. Both legal teams approved the language. I'm aware, Daniel said, but I'd still like us all to read it together. Out loud. Slowly, the room grew a little quieter. Reed let out a small chuckle. Daniel, we've all read the contract, multiple times. I know, Daniel said, so this will be very quick. He slid a printed copy of the contract across the table toward Reed, and another toward the lawyer. Not the signed copy. A working copy Martin had printed that morning. Clause 17, Daniel said. Second paragraph. Third sentence. Please read that sentence out loud. The thin lawyer adjusted his glasses, clearly a little annoyed, and read. Carter Holdings assumes all post-merger liabilities, including but not limited to operational losses, outstanding debt obligations, and any undisclosed legal exposure originating before the merger date. Daniel nodded slowly. Thank you. Now, I'd like you to read the same sentence from the version your team sent my office last week. Reed's smile was gone now. That's unnecessary, Reed said. The language is standard. Humor me, Daniel replied, his voice still calm. One of Daniel's board members shifted in his seat. Daniel, what is this about? Daniel didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Reed. After a long moment, Reed nodded to his lawyer. The lawyer opened his laptop, pulled up the earlier draft, scrolled, then stopped. Read it, Daniel said. The lawyer hesitated. Read it, Daniel repeated, louder this time. The lawyer cleared his throat. Both parties agree to share all post-merger liabilities, including operational losses, outstanding debt obligations, and any undisclosed legal exposure originating before the merger date. Silence. Real silence this time, the kind that fills a room so completely that even breathing sounds loud. Daniel leaned back slightly and looked around the table, making eye contact with each person one by one. Those two sentences, he said quietly, do not mean the same thing. No one spoke. Daniel continued. One says we share the risk. The other says, I take all the risk. One of those sentences builds a partnership. The other one builds a trap. Reed leaned forward, his voice controlled. If you're suggesting our firm altered a legal document, you better be very sure. Daniel met his eyes. I am very sure. He reached into his folder and slid a printed sheet across the table. Printer logs, the page containing Clause 17, was printed separately from the rest of the contract. Different printer. Different time. 8:42 p.m. Hours after the final version was approved by legal, the thin lawyer's face went pale. Daniel placed another sheet on the table. A still image from the security camera. Linda Harper in the copy room, bent over the contract. Security footage, Daniel said. Your clause, my secretary. One page, one change, one very expensive mistake for someone. Reed didn't touch the papers. He just stared at Daniel. You're making a very serious accusation, Reed said quietly. Daniel nodded. Yes, I am. He paused, then added, and I'm not the one who found it. Reed frowned slightly. Then who did? Daniel thought of a little girl sitting on a reception couch, swinging her feet, reading books people threw away. He thought of a small finger pointing to a single line in a contract. He looked back at Reed. Someone, Daniel said, you never even noticed was in the room. Michael Reed was the first to recover. He leaned back in his chair slowly, fingers steepled together, the way powerful men do when they are deciding whether to deny, attack, or pretend nothing is wrong. That's a very interesting story, Daniel, Reed said. Printer logs, security footage, a changed clause, but you're still missing one thing. Daniel didn't blink. And what is that? Proof that anyone in this room knew about it, Reed said calmly. You're implying intent, fraud, corporate sabotage. Those are big words. Careers end over words like that. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. The lawyers were no longer relaxed. Papers were being reread. Phones were being checked under the table. Daniel rested his hands on the table. You're right. Those are big words. Reed nodded slightly, as if pleased to hear that. Daniel continued. Which is why I didn't go to the police last night. I wanted to understand who benefits from Clause 17 looking like this. He slid another document across the table. This one was a financial summary. If Carter Holdings assumes all liability, Daniel said, and if hypothetically there were undisclosed debts, pending lawsuits, or regulatory violations inside Reed Capital's subsidiary companies, then after the merger, those problems would become my problems. My company would absorb the losses, my stock would collapse, and Reed Capital could walk away clean, with the merger money already paid. No one spoke. Daniel tapped the paper lightly. In simple terms, I would be buying your problems without knowing it. Reed's lawyer spoke this time. That is a hypothetical scenario. Daniel looked at him. Of course it is. That's why liability clauses exist. To decide who carries risk when hypotheticals become reality. He paused, then added quietly, but changing that clause without telling the other party turns a hypothetical into a plan. The room went very still again. One of Daniel's board members, an older man named Howard Grant, cleared his throat. Daniel, are you saying someone inside our company worked with someone inside Reed Capital to alter the contract? Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was calm and steady. I'm saying Clause 17 was different yesterday, and now it's not. I'm saying that page was printed separately from the rest of the contract, and I'm saying we have security footage of the page being handled in the copy room after legal approved the final draft. He looked around the table, and I'm saying someone thought I wouldn't notice. Reed's expression hardened slightly. Or maybe, Reed said, your office made a clerical error, and now you're trying to blame us because you signed too fast. A few people at the table shifted at that. It was a direct attack, and everyone knew it. Daniel nodded slowly. That's a fair argument. If this were just about a typo, he opened his folder again and took out one more sheet of paper. This is the version history from our document system, he said. Every time a contract is edited, the system logs who opened it, who edited it, and when. He placed the paper on the table and turned it so everyone could read it. Clause 17 was modified at 8:37 p.m. last night, Daniel said. The login used was Linda Harper's account. My executive secretary. Murmurs spread around the table. Howard Grant looked shocked. Linda? She's been with this company for 9 years. Daniel nodded. Yes, she has. Reed said nothing now. He was watching Daniel very carefully. Daniel continued. At 8:42 p.m., 5 minutes after that edit, the page containing Clause 17 was printed from the copy room printer, not the main printer used for the rest of the contract. Hell, let that sink in. So now, Daniel said, we have a modified clause, a user login, a print record, and security footage of that same page being handled in the copy room. He folded his hands again. That's no longer a clerical error. That's a timeline. The thin lawyer leaned toward Reed and whispered something. Reed didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Daniel. Finally, Reed spoke again. What exactly do you want, Daniel? Daniel answered immediately. The truth. Reed gave a small, humorless smile. The truth is expensive. Daniel nodded. So is fraud. Another long silence. Then Howard Grant spoke again, his voice more serious now. Daniel, if someone inside this company altered a legal document tied to a merger, that's not just a business problem. That's a criminal problem. Yes, Daniel said. It is. Howard looked around the room. Then I think this meeting needs to be paused until we understand exactly what happened. Reed leaned back again, his jaw tight. If you walk away from this deal now, Daniel, the market will assume Carter Holdings failed due diligence. Your stock will drop. Your investors will panic. You'll lose hundreds of millions before the week is over. Daniel looked at him. If I sign that contract, I won't lose hundreds of millions. He paused. I'll lose everything. Reed held his gaze for a long moment. Then he stood slowly and adjusted his jacket. You're making a mistake, Reed said quietly. Daniel stood too. No. The mistake was almost signing a contract I didn't fully control. Reed picked up his folder. Deals like this, he said, are built on trust. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Reed looked at him one last time. And now you don't trust me. Daniel's voice was calm when he answered. Now I don't trust anyone. Reed left the room with his lawyers behind him. The door closed softly, but the sound felt louder than it should have. The remaining board members sat in silence. Finally, Howard Grant said, Daniel, who found the clause? Daniel looked out the window at the city for a moment before answering. A little girl, he said. Howard frowned. I'm sorry? Daniel turned back to the table. She was waiting for her mother to finish cleaning offices. I asked her to take the contract to the conference room. She read Clause 17 and told me it was different from the version she saw the day before. No one spoke. Howard sat back slowly. You're telling me this entire deal almost destroyed this company, and the only person who noticed was a 6-year-old child? Daniel nodded once. Yes, another board member whispered, almost to himself. We have an entire legal department. Daniel finished the sentence for him, and none of them were sitting in the copy room when someone thought no one important was watching. The room fell quiet again. After a moment, Howard said, Where is this girl now? Daniel thought of Annie that morning, standing in his office with her backpack, speaking calmly about printer dots and traps. She's at school, Daniel said. She thinks I'm just going to a meeting. Howard nodded slowly. That girl may have just saved this company. Daniel looked down at the folder containing the contract, then closed it firmly. Yes, he said quietly. She did. Then he added, almost to himself, which means whoever planned this just learned something very dangerous. Howard looked at him. What's that? Daniel's voice was low. That I didn't walk into the trap alone. Daniel did not go back to work after the meeting. Instead, he went back to his office, closed the door, and for the first time that day, allowed himself to sit down and think like a man whose life had almost been erased by a single paragraph. At 11:20 a.m., Martin knocked once and entered without waiting. I spoke to the 2 IT guys you trust, Martin said. We pulled the document history from the internal server, not just the printer logs. Daniel looked up, and Martin placed a folder on the desk and opened it. The original contract, the one legal approved, was saved at 3:14 p.m. yesterday. After that, the file was accessed again at 8:31 p.m. using Linda Harper's login. 7 minutes later, at 8:38 p.m., the file was modified. At 8:42 p.m., one page was printed Clause 17. Not the whole contract. Just that page. Daniel nodded slowly. And the rest of the contract? Printed earlier at 5:02 p.m. From the executive printer, Martin said. So the contract you signed was mostly printed at 5:02, except for Clause 17, which was printed separately at 8:42 and swapped in. Daniel leaned back and exhaled slowly. So someone replaced one page in a 100-page contract. Yes, Martin said. And if Annie hadn't noticed, no one would have. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Where is Linda now? Martin hesitated. She called in sick this morning. Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. Of course she did. I sent someone to her apartment, Martin said. No one answered the door. Her car is gone. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking down at the streets far below. People were moving. Traffic flowing. The city continuing like nothing had happened. People don't risk prison to change one page unless someone is paying them a lot of money, Daniel said. Martin nodded. You think Reed? I think Reed is too smart to touch the paper himself, Daniel said, but I think he's smart enough to make sure someone else does. He turned back to Martin. Start digging into Linda's finances. Quietly. Bank transfers, new accounts, anything unusual in the last 6 months. Martin nodded. Already ask our forensic accountant to start. Daniel walked back to his desk and looked at the contract again. Then he picked it up, flipped to clause 17, and stared at the paragraph that had almost ended his company. All of this, he said quietly. For one paragraph. Martin leaned against the chair across from the desk. It's not just a paragraph. It's liability. If Reed Capital has hidden debt somewhere, and your company assumes liability after the merger, then you would be responsible for everything they buried. Daniel nodded. Which means this wasn't about partnership. It was about dumping a sinking ship onto my dock and letting me pay for the repairs. Martin crossed his arms. So what do you do now? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked a different question. Martin, do you know why big companies don't usually get destroyed from the outside? Martin shrugged. Why? Because they build walls, Daniel said. Legal walls, financial walls, security walls. It's very hard to attack a company from the outside. He tapped clause 17 with his finger. But if someone inside opens the gate, you don't need to break the wall. Martin nodded slowly. An inside job. Yes, Daniel said. And inside jobs are never done by just one person. One person changes a page. Another person looks the other way. Another person makes sure the deal moves fast, so no one reads too carefully. He closed the contract and put it back into the folder. This is bigger than Linda, he said. Linda is the hand. I want the person holding the leash. At that moment, Daniel's phone rang. It was the forensic accountant, Julia Myers. Daniel answered. Julia, Daniel, she said, getting straight to the point. You were right to ask me to look at Linda Harper's accounts. She received a wire transfer 3 weeks ago. $200,000. Daniel's expression didn't change. From where? Shell Company, Julia said. Registered in Delaware. But the funding source traces back through 2 layers to an investment entity connected to Reed Capital. Martin looked up sharply when he heard that. Daniel walked slowly back to his chair and sat down. So, he said quietly into the phone. Linda didn't just wake up one day and decide to risk her career. No, Julia said. Someone paid her to change that page. Daniel thanked her and hung up. For a few seconds, neither he nor Martin spoke. Finally, Martin said, That's it then. That's the link. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, that's the link. He looked down at the contract again, then said something very quietly. Do you know the most dangerous part of this whole story, Martin? Martin shook his head. Daniel's voice was low. The most dangerous part is that their entire plan almost worked. Not because they were smarter than us. Not because their lawyers were better. He paused. It almost worked because no one pays attention to the people who clean the rooms. Martin didn't say anything. Daniel continued. Annie was invisible to them, just a kid waiting for her mother, which means they spoke freely, moved papers freely, changed pages freely, because in their minds, no one important was watching. He stood up, picked up his jacket again, and headed for the door. Where are you going? Martin asked. Daniel opened the door, then looked back. To visit a school, he said, because there's a 6-year-old girl who needs to understand something very important. What's that? Martin asked. Daniel's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained serious. That she just stepped into a world where people don't forgive you for costing them millions of dollars. He paused. And if I'm going to finish this fight, I need to make sure she and her mother are protected. Because the people who tried to steal my company are about to realize the reason they failed is a child. Daniel Carter had not been inside an elementary school in more than 30 years. The hallway felt smaller than he remembered schools being, the ceilings lower, the walls covered with bright paper stars, drawings of houses, and crooked letters spelling out words like dream, kinness, and courage. Children's voices echoed from somewhere down the hall, a mix of laughter, shouting, and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. It was a very different world from the glass towers and silent boardrooms where people destroyed each other with signatures instead of fists. The school secretary looked up as Daniel approached the front desk. She recognized him immediately. Most adults did, but she didn't treat him like a billionaire. In a school, everyone waited their turn. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. "Yes," Daniel said. "I'm here to see Annie Williams. First grade." The secretary smiled slightly. "Are you family?" Daniel hesitated for half a second. "I'm a friend of her mother." The secretary studied him for a moment, then picked up the phone and called the classroom. A few minutes later, Annie appeared in the hallway with her teacher, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime teaching children how to become decent adults. "Annie," the teacher said gently, "this gentleman is here to see you." Annie looked surprised. "Mr. Carter?" Daniel nodded. "Hi, Annie." The teacher looked between them, curious now. "I'll give you a few minutes," she said. "You can talk here." She walked a few steps away but stayed close enough to see them, the way teachers do when they are responsible for other people's children. Annie looked up at Daniel. "Did you go to the meeting?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Did you take the contract?" she asked. "No," he said. "I did exactly what you said. I told them the final copies were being prepared." Annie nodded once, like that was the correct move in a chess game. "Did you find proof?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. The page was changed, printed separately, and the person who changed it was paid to do it. Annie was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Are you going to call the police?" "Soon," Daniel said. "But before I do that, I need to make sure you and your mom are safe." Annie frowned slightly. "Safe from what?" Daniel looked down the hallway. Children were walking past in lines, holding hands, talking about lunch and math and who got in trouble for talking too much. Normal problems, the kind of problems children were supposed to have. "Annie," Daniel said quietly, "the people who changed that contract were trying to take my company. That's hundreds of millions of dollars. Maybe more." Annie didn't fully understand how much money that was, but she understood the tone. "When people think they're about to lose that much money," Daniel continued, "they don't always behave nicely, and right now, the reason they lost that money is you." Annie looked down at her shoes for a moment, then back up at him. "I just read the paper," she said. "I know," Daniel said, "but you saw something they didn't want anyone to see. And now I need you to be careful." Annie was quiet, thinking in that serious way she had. "Like not talking to strangers?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said, "like not talking to strangers. And like telling your mom or your teacher if anyone asks you questions about the contract or about me, you don't answer them. You tell an adult you trust." Annie nodded slowly. "Am I in trouble?" The question hit Daniel harder than he expected. "No," he said gently. "You are not in trouble. You did something very brave. You told the truth, when it would have been easier to say nothing." Annie looked relieved, but still serious. "My mom says telling the truth can still get you in trouble sometimes." Daniel gave a small, sad smile. "Your mom is a very smart woman." He reached into his pocket and took out a small card. Not a business card, something else. It had a phone number written on it in pen. "This is Martin," Daniel said. "He works with me. If you or your mom ever feel scared, or if something strange happens, you call this number, day or night." Annie took the card carefully, like it was something important. "Okay," she said. Her teacher walked back over then, sensing the conversation was serious. "Everything all right?" the teacher asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Annie just helped me with a very important problem at work, and I came to say thank you." The teacher looked at Annie with a small smile. "That sounds like Annie." Daniel looked at the teacher. "I don't mean to alarm you, but if anyone comes to the school asking Annie questions about my company, or about any documents, I would appreciate a phone call." The teacher's expression changed slightly, not fear, but awareness. Adult awareness. The understanding that the world sometimes reaches into places it shouldn't. "Of course," she said. "Our students' safety comes first." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." He looked down at Annie one more time. "I have to go back to work now. There are some people who made a very big mistake, and I need to make sure they don't hurt anyone else trying to fix it." Annie nodded. "Are you going to win?" Daniel thought about the boardroom. The altered contract. Linda's bank transfer. Michael Reed's face when Clause 17 was read out loud. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I know this, I would have lost for sure If you hadn't said anything. Annie seemed to think about that. Then she said, "My teacher says when you don't know what to do, you should just do the right thing and let the rest happen later." Daniel smiled slightly. "Your teacher is smarter than most CEOs I know." Annie smiled a little at that. As Daniel turned to leave, Annie called after him. "Mr. Carter?" He turned back. "Yes?" She held up the card he had given her. "I'll keep it safe." Daniel nodded. "Good." He walked down the hallway past the drawings and the paper stars and the small desks, and as he stepped outside into the Chicago air again, he realized something he hadn't expected. In the boardroom, people had been fighting over millions of dollars. In the copy room, someone had committed a crime for money. But in a small school hallway, a 6-year-old girl had told the truth simply because it was the truth. And somehow, that was the most powerful move anyone had made so far. When Daniel returned to Carter Holdings that afternoon, the building no longer felt like a place where deals were made. It felt like a place where something had been hiding in the walls for a long time. And now that it had been discovered, everyone was pretending the walls had always been clean. Martin was waiting in Daniel's office with Julia Myers, the forensic accountant. Several documents were spread across the desk. Bank records, corporate registration files, printer logs, and a printed still frame from the security camera showing Linda Harper bent over the contract in the copy room. Julia pointed to one of the pages. "The shell company that paid Linda is called Fairview Consulting Group." Sounds harmless, right? But it's not a real consulting company. It's a pass-through. Money comes in, money goes out. "From Reed Capital," Daniel said. Julia nodded. "Through 2 intermediary accounts, but yes. The money originated from an investment entity controlled by Reed," Martin added, "and Linda isn't answering her phone. Her apartment manager says she left early this morning with 2 suitcases." Daniel walked slowly to his desk and looked down at the photo from the security camera. "People don't run," he said quietly, "unless they know they're guilty or they know someone is going to make them disappear." Julia crossed her arms. "You think Reed told her to leave?" "I think Reed told someone to tell her to leave," Daniel said. "Men like Reed don't give instructions directly if they can avoid it." He sat down and looked at the financial records again. $200,000, he said. "That's not retirement money. That's do this one thing and keep your mouth shut money." Julia nodded. "And probably promised more after the merger." Martin leaned forward slightly. "So what's the next move?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the timeline Julia had printed. 3:14 p.m. Legal approved final contract. 5:02 p.m. Full contract printed. 8:31 p.m. Linda accessed file. 8:38 p.m. Clause 17 modified. 8:42 p.m. Clause 17 printed separately. 9:10 p.m. Contract reassembled. 10:03 p.m. Daniel signed. A perfect window. A perfect swap. A perfect plan. Except for one thing. "Annie, they planned everything," Daniel said quietly. "They knew when legal would finish. They knew I would sign that night. They knew the board meeting was in the morning so no one would reread the whole contract again." Julia nodded. "It was planned down to the hour." Daniel tapped the paper with the timeline. "But they planned for lawyers. They planned for auditors. They planned for executives." He looked up at them. "They didn't plan for a 6-year-old who likes to read." No one said anything for a moment. Then Martin asked, "What happens when Reed realizes how much we know?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "He already knows." Julia frowned. "How?" "Because I stopped the deal in a room full of his lawyers," Daniel said. "Because I showed printer logs and security photos. Because men like Reed don't need proof to know when a plan has failed. They can feel it." Martin nodded slowly. "Then the question is, what does a man like Reed do when a billion-dollar plan collapses?" Daniel's voice was calm. "He protects himself. First, he removes anything that can be traced back to him. Documents, emails, people." Julia looked up sharply. "People?" Daniel nodded once. "Linda is already gone. That's not a coincidence. That's step 1. The room felt colder after that. Martin spoke carefully. "And step 2? Daniel looked down at the security photo again. Linda Harper in the copy room. Clause 17 open on the table. "Step 2, Daniel said quietly, "is figuring out who else knows." Julia and Martin both understood immediately. "The lawyers in the room," Julia said. The IT guys who pulled the logs, Martin added. You, Daniel said, looking at Julia. You traced the money. Then he paused. And Annie. The room went silent. Julia spoke first. She's a child. Yes, Daniel said. Which makes her invisible, and being invisible is what allowed her to see everything. Martin's jaw tightened. You think Reed would go after a kid? Daniel didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was very calm, which made it worse. I think Reed will convince himself that Annie is not a child, Daniel said. He will think of her as a risk. And men like Reed don't eliminate risks because they are angry. They eliminate risks because they are calm. Julia sat down slowly. Then we need to move fast. Daniel nodded. I want everything copied and stored in 3 different places, not just on company servers. External drives, legal offices, somewhere Reed can't reach. Martin said, I'll handle security, Julia said. I'll prepare a full forensic report. If this goes to court, we need a clear financial trail. Daniel stood and walked to the window again. The city looked the same as it had that morning. But everything was different now. When I started this company, he said, I thought the biggest risk would be bad markets, bad investments, bad timing. He looked down at the street far below. I never thought the biggest risk would be trusting the wrong people inside my own building. Martin said quietly, So what do we do now? Daniel turned back to them. Now, he said, we stop treating this like a business dispute. Julia looked at him. What do we treat it like? Daniel's answer was simple. Akrimi. He walked back to his desk and closed the folder containing the contract. Tomorrow morning, he said, I'm meeting with a federal attorney. Fraud. Document tampering. Conspiracy. If Reed wanted a war over paper, I'm going to move the war into a courtroom. Martin nodded once. And Annie? Daniel looked at the card he had written Martin's number on. He imagined it in Annie's small backpack, next to pencils and homework and library books. Annie, Daniel said quietly, is the reason we're still standing. He paused, and that means from this moment on, we make sure nothing happens to her. Not because she's useful to us. He looked at both of them, but because we owe her the truth, and we owe her safety. Outside the glass walls, the city kept moving, unaware that somewhere high above the streets, a war had begun not with guns or shouting, but with a changed paragraph, a printed page, and a little girl who refused to ignore a sentence that didn't look right. By the time Daniel left the office that night, it was almost 9 p.m., the same hour Linda Harper had stood in the copy room and changed Clause 17. He noticed that detail as he stepped into the elevator. Same building, same hour, same quiet, but everything was different now. When the elevator doors opened on the lobby floor, Martin was already standing near the security desk, talking to one of the night guards. He walked over as Daniel approached. I didn't want to say this upstairs, Martin said quietly. But we may have a problem. Daniel stopped walking. What kind of problem? Martin glanced toward the glass doors, then back at Daniel. Someone was asking about Annie today. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Who? Man in a gray suit, Martin said. Didn't give a name. Said he was from a private education foundation and wanted to confirm Annie Williams' school and address because she was recommended for a scholarship program. Daniel stared at him. And the guard told him? Martin shook his head. No. Night guard said he'd need to speak to HR. The man left a card and said he'd come back. Martin handed Daniel the card. It was thick, expensive paper, no company logo, just a name and a phone number. Thomas Keller, Education Outreach Coordinator. Daniel looked at the card for a long moment, then slipped it into his pocket. That didn't take long, he said quietly. Martin crossed his arms. You think it's Reed? I think Reed is trying to find out how much Annie knows, Daniel said. And where she lives, and who she talks to. Martin's voice hardened. You want me to put someone on the building entrance? Make sure that guy doesn't come back? Daniel shook his head. No. If we scare him off, Reed will just send someone else we don't recognize. I'd rather see who comes through the front door. They walked outside into the cool Chicago night. Traffic moved slowly under the streetlights, and for a moment, everything looked normal again. But Daniel knew better now. Normal was just what things looked like when you didn't know where the danger was. Tomorrow, Daniel said, I'm moving Annie and her mom into a hotel for a few days. Somewhere Reed won't think to look. Martin nodded. I'll arrange it. Different name, different reservation. Daniel looked up at the building behind them. 30 floors of glass and steel. You know what the mistake was? Daniel said. What? Martin asked. Reed thought this was about money, Daniel said. He thought if the deal went through, he'd win. If the deal failed, he'd lose. He shook his head slightly. He still thinks this is a business problem. Contracts, liability, stock prices. Martin looked at him. And you don't? Daniel's voice was quiet. No. The moment someone paid an employee to alter a legal document, this stopped being business. He paused, and the moment someone started asking questions about a 6-year-old girl, this stopped being a negotiation. They stood in silence for a moment as a bus passed, its windows glowing. People inside staring at their phones, thinking about dinner, about bills, about normal life. Do you have kids, Martin? Daniel asked suddenly. Martin nodded. 2 boys, 12 and 9. Daniel nodded slowly. Then you understand something Reed doesn't. What's that? Daniel looked back toward the building one more time. Money is important, he said. Companies are important, but there are some lines you don't cross. He looked at Martin, and going after a child because she told the truth is one of those lines. Martin's jaw tightened. Then what do we do if he crosses it? Daniel's answer came without hesitation. Then we don't just beat him in court, Daniel said. We make sure he never does business in this country again. The next afternoon, Annie's mother, Laura, was finishing her shift in a smaller office on the 12th floor when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number, but something told her to pick up. Hello? Miss Williams, this is Daniel Carter. Laura straightened immediately. Mr. Carter, is Annie all right? Yes, Daniel said. Annie is fine, but I need to talk to you. In person. Today. If possible. There was something in his voice that made Laura's stomach tighten. Did something happen? I'd rather explain in person, Daniel said. But I need you to trust me on one thing. For the next few days, you and Annie should not stay at your apartment. Laura went very quiet on the other end of the line. Mr. Carter, she said slowly, you're starting to scare me. Daniel didn't try to soften it. Someone altered a legal contract in my company. Annie saw the change. The people who did it just lost a lot of money because Annie spoke up. Laura sat down slowly in the empty office, her hand gripping the phone tighter. And you think they would hurt a child? She asked quietly. Daniel answered honestly. I think they would try to scare a child, and I don't want to find out how far they're willing to go. Laura closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, her voice was different. Stronger. Like a mother who had just decided something. What do we need to do? She asked. That evening, Annie stood in her small bedroom watching her mother pack a suitcase. Are we going on a trip? Annie asked. Laura forced a small smile. Something like that, baby. Is it because of the contract? Annie asked. Laura stopped folding clothes and looked at her daughter. Mr. Carter told you not to talk about that with anyone. I know, Annie said. I'm only talking to you. Laura sat on the edge of the bed and pulled Annie close. Sometimes, Laura said softly, doing the right thing makes life harder before it makes it better. Annie thought about that. Are we in trouble? Laura kissed the top of her head. No, baby. But some very rich, very powerful people are in trouble. And sometimes those kinds of people don't like the person who tells the truth. Annie was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, Is Mr. Carter in trouble too? Laura nodded slightly. Yes, but he's the kind of man who doesn't run away from trouble. Annie looked down at the small card with Martin's phone number that she kept in her backpack. Then we won't run away either, Annie said. Laura held her a little tighter after that, because she knew something Annie didn't. Adults understood fear in a way children didn't. And somewhere in Chicago, a man named Michael Reed had just learned that his perfect plan had been destroyed by a child. Men like that didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. The hotel Daniel chose was not one of the famous ones downtown where businessmen and politicians stayed. It was a quiet place near the river, the kind of hotel that mostly hosted traveling families and retired couples visiting the city. No large lobby, no press, no attention. Laura stood by the window of the hotel room, looking down at the parking lot while Annie sat on the bed doing her homework with a pencil she kept chewing when she was thinking too hard. You don't have to watch the parking lot, Annie said without looking up. Mr. Carter said we're safe here. Laura turned from the window and tried to smile. I know. I just like to see who comes and goes. Annie nodded like that made sense. Then she went back to her math worksheet. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Laura froze for half a second, then walked to the door and looked through the peephole. "Room service," a voice said. Laura hadn't ordered room service. She didn't open the door. "Who is it?" she asked through the door. "Front desk sent up some complimentary dinner," the voice replied. Laura still didn't open the door. "We didn't order anything." There was a pause, then footsteps walking away down the hallway. Laura stood there for a long moment before she let out a slow breath and walked back into the room. "Was it food?" Annie asked. "Wrong room," Laura said quietly, but both of them knew it probably wasn't. Across the city, Daniel was sitting in a conference room in a federal building, not a corporate office this time. The room had plain walls, metal chairs, and a long table that had seen a lot of people tell the truth and a lot of people lie. Across from him sat Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Torres and a man from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit named Special Agent Mark Benson. Rachel flipped through the documents Daniel had brought: printer logs, document version history, bank transfers, shell company records, and the still images from the security camera. "This is a very clean timeline," she said. "Document tampering, financial transfer, intent to shift liability under false pretenses. If we can connect Reed directly to the payment or to Linda Harper, this becomes conspiracy and fraud at a federal level." Agent Benson nodded. "We've seen this structure before. Acquire a company, dump hidden liabilities into it, let it collapse, and walk away with the cash. It's ugly, but it happens." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "He tried to do it to me." Benson looked at him. "Yes, and if what you're saying is correct, the only reason it didn't work is because someone noticed the change before the contract was executed in the meeting." Daniel nodded once. "A 6-year-old girl noticed." Rachel paused and looked up. "A child?" Daniel explained briefly. Annie in the copy room, reading the contract the day before, noticing Clause 17 had different wording, telling him after he signed but before the meeting. Rachel closed the file slowly. "Then that child is a witness." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "She's 6. I know," Rachel said. "But if this goes to court, the defense is going to ask one question: how did you discover the clause was changed? And the truthful answer is, because a child told you. It didn't match the version she read the day before." Agent Benson leaned back in his chair, "which means if Reed's lawyers are any good, they're going to try to discredit that child. They'll say she's confused, she imagined it, she misunderstood what she read." Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "She didn't misunderstand. I believe you," Benson said, "but court isn't about what we believe. It's about what we can prove and what a jury believes." Rachel added, "The printer logs, the document history, and the money trail are strong. Very strong. The child's testimony isn't the only piece, but it explains motive and timing. It explains how the change was discovered before the meeting." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "If we move forward with this, what happens next?" Rachel answered clearly, "We open a formal investigation. We freeze the accounts connected to the shell company. We issue a warrant for Linda Harper. And if we can tie Reed Capital to the payment and document tampering, we bring charges." "And how long does that take?" Daniel asked. "Months," Rachel said. "Maybe longer." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Reed will try to bury this before that happens." Agent Benson nodded. "He'll try. He'll move money, delete emails, distance himself from Linda, maybe claim she acted alone." Daniel said quietly, "She didn't act alone." "No," Benson agreed. "People don't pay $200,000 for a secretary to freelance a crime." Rachel closed the folder. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to be very direct with you. Once we start this, it becomes public eventually. Reed will know. His lawyers will know. The media may know." Daniel nodded. "I understand." Rachel held his gaze. "Are you ready for a very public fight?" Daniel thought about the boardroom, the contract, the printer logs, Annie sitting on a hotel bed doing homework while her mother watched the door like someone expecting trouble. "Yes," he said, "I am." That night, back at the hotel, Annie was already asleep when Laura's phone rang. She stepped quietly into the hallway before answering. "Miss Williams, it's Daniel." Laura lowered her voice. "We had someone knock on the door earlier. Said it was room service. We didn't order anything." Daniel was silent for a second. "Did you open the door?" "No." "Good," he said. "Very good." Listen to me carefully. Starting tomorrow, a friend of mine is going to stay in a room down the hall. You may not see him much, but he'll be there." Laura closed her eyes for a moment. "Is it really that serious?" Daniel answered honestly. "Yes." Laura looked through the hotel hallway window at the lights of the city. "All of this," she said quietly, "because my daughter read a piece of paper." Daniel's voice was calm on the other end of the line. "No, Miss Williams. All of this because some very powerful people thought they could cheat, and no one would notice." He paused. "And your daughter proved them wrong." Laura looked back at the room where Annie was sleeping, her small backpack on the chair, her homework still spread across the bed. "She's just a child," Laura said softly. "I know," Daniel said, "but sometimes the truth doesn't come from powerful people. Sometimes it comes from the person no one was paying attention to." There was a long silence on the phone. Then Laura asked the question that had been sitting in her chest all day. "Mr. Carter, are we going to be okay?" Daniel looked out at the dark Chicago skyline from his office window before answering. "Yes," he said quietly, "we are." But for the first time since this began, Daniel Carter wasn't completely sure that was true. The first threat did not come with a weapon, a shout, or a broken window. It came as a letter. Daniel received it Monday morning, delivered in a plain white envelope with no return address. It was placed on his desk with the rest of the morning mail, mixed in with financial reports, meeting requests, and legal correspondence. Nothing about it looked unusual. He opened it while standing, half reading as he walked toward the window. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. He saw the photograph first. It was Annie. She was standing outside her school, her backpack on, her head turned slightly, as if someone had called her name. The photo had been taken from across the street, maybe from inside a car. Annie didn't look scared in the picture. She looked like a normal 6-year-old waiting for her mother. Daniel's hand tightened slightly around the photo. He read the note under it. "She seems like a very smart girl. Smart girls should be careful what they read." There was no signature. Daniel stood very still for a long time, the photo in one hand, the note in the other. Then he picked up his phone and called Martin. "Come to my office," Daniel said. Now, Martin arrived in less than 2 minutes. Daniel handed him the photo and the note without saying a word. Martin looked at the photo, then at the note, and his jaw tightened. "This was taken recently." "Yes," Daniel said. "Yesterday, I think. Maybe this morning." Martin flipped the photo over. "Blank. They're not even hiding it," Martin said quietly. "No," Daniel said, "they're not." Martin looked up. "You want me to call the FBI?" Daniel nodded. "Agent Benson. And increase security at the hotel. 2 people, not 1. And I want someone at Annie's school, whenever she's there." Martin was already pulling out his phone as he left the office. Daniel walked back to his desk and sat down slowly. He placed the photograph in front of him and stared at it. Annie had been smiling when he saw her at school. She had asked him if he was going to win. She had gone back to class and probably raised her hand to answer questions and colored pictures and eaten lunch like any other child. And somewhere nearby, someone had been watching her through a camera lens. Daniel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, the hesitation he had felt before was gone. Now it was personal. That afternoon, Daniel met Rachel Torres and Agent Benson again. This time with the photograph and the note placed on the table between them. Benson looked at the photo for a long moment. "This is intimidation," he said. "Witness intimidation. Potentially obstruction." Rachel nodded. "They're trying to scare you into dropping the case before we file formal charges," Daniel said quietly. "They're not trying to scare me." He tapped the photo gently. "They're trying to scare her, or her mother. They think I'll back off if they make this about a child instead of a contract." Rachel looked at him carefully. "And will you?" Daniel's answer was immediate. "No." Benson leaned forward. "We'll put surveillance on Reed and his senior people. Phones, emails, financial movement. But I'll be honest with you, Mr. Carter, men like Reed don't send letters themselves. They hire people who hire people." Daniel nodded. "I know," Rachel said. "We're moving forward with a warrant for Linda Harper. If we find her before Reed's people do, she becomes our leverage." Daniel looked at the photo again. "You think Reed will try to make her disappear?" Benson didn't hesitate. "If he thinks she can tie the money directly to him, yes." The room went quiet. Finally, Daniel said, Then we find her first. That evening, Daniel went to the hotel himself. Laura opened the door, and Annie ran over immediately when she saw him. "Mr. Carter," Annie said, "did you catch the people who changed the contract?" Daniel looked down at her for a moment before answering. "Not yet. But we're getting closer." Laura saw something in his face and knew immediately something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Daniel stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He handed Laura the photograph and the note. Laura covered her mouth with her hand when she saw the picture. "Oh my God." Annie looked up at them. "What is it?" Laura quickly turned the photo so Annie couldn't see it clearly. "Nothing, baby." But Annie had already seen enough. "That's my school," she said. "Who took that picture?" Daniel crouched down so he was at eye level with her. He spoke calmly, the way you speak when the truth is serious, but you don't want to put fear into a child. "Some people are upset because the contract didn't work the way they planned," he said. "They're trying to scare us so we stop asking questions." Annie was quiet for a moment. "Are you scared?" she asked. Daniel thought about the boardroom, the altered contract, the money trail, the photograph taken from across the street. "Yes," he said honestly, "I am." Annie looked at him for a moment. Then she said something very quietly. "My mom says being scared doesn't mean you're supposed to stop. It just means you know something is important." Laura closed her eyes for a second when she heard that. Daniel nodded slowly. "Your mom is right." He stood up and looked at Laura. "Federal agents are looking for the woman who changed the contract. They're building a case against the people who paid her. Until this is over, you and Annie won't go back to the apartment, and Annie won't walk to school alone. Ever." Laura nodded. "We understand." Annie looked between them. "Is this because I read the contract?" Daniel looked at her and chose his words carefully. "This is because you told the truth," he said. "And sometimes the truth makes bad people nervous." Annie thought about that. "Are bad people always rich?" she asked. Daniel almost smiled, but not quite. "No. But sometimes rich people think they can do bad things, and no one will stop them." Annie nodded slowly. "But we are stopping them." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "We are." Outside the hotel window, the city lights flickered on one by one as the sky went dark. Somewhere out there was Michael Reed, moving money, calling lawyers, trying to fix a plan that had started to fall apart the moment a 6-year-old girl noticed that one sentence in a contract did not match the sentence she had read the day before. And now, the fight was no longer about a contract. It was about who was willing to tell the truth, and who was willing to hurt a child to keep it buried. The call came at 2:13 a.m. Daniel woke to the vibration of his phone on the nightstand, the room still dark, the city outside silent except for the distant hum of traffic. He reached for the phone, already knowing that calls at this hour never brought good news. "Daniel," Agent Benson said on the other end, his voice low and alert. "We found Linda Harper." Daniel sat up immediately. "Where?" "Small motel outside Milwaukee," Benson said. "Paid in cash. Checked in 2 days ago under a different name. We got there before anyone else." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Is she talking?" There was a short pause. "She's scared," Benson said, "which means she might." "I'm coming," Daniel said. By 5:40 a.m., Daniel was sitting in a small interview room at a federal building in Milwaukee. The room looked almost identical to the one in Chicago. Plain table, metal chairs, a camera in the corner, walls that had heard a lot of people confess things they thought they would never say out loud. Linda Harper sat on the other side of the table. She looked nothing like the composed executive secretary who had managed Daniel's schedule for 9 years. Her hair was messy, her eyes red from lack of sleep, and her hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table. When Daniel walked in, she looked up and immediately started crying. "I'm sorry," she said before he even sat down. "I am so sorry." Daniel sat across from her but didn't say anything right away. "Do you know what they told me?" Linda said, her voice shaking. "They said it was just a wording change. They said it was already agreed to, that it was just a clarification. They said no one would get hurt." "Who is they?" Agent Benson asked quietly from the corner. Linda wiped her eyes. "A man named Keller. Thomas Keller. He said he worked with Reed's company. He said Mr. Reed knew about it." Daniel felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he said nothing. Linda continued, words rushing out now. "He knew exactly which clause to change. He told me to wait until after legal approved the contract, then access the file. Change clause 17. Print just that page and swap it into the final copy. He said, Mr. R.D. Carter would never read the whole thing again before the meeting because it was already reviewed. Daniel spoke for the first time, his voice calm. And the $200,000? Linda nodded slowly. Half before, half after the merger. That's what he promised. Agent Benson leaned forward slightly. Did you ever speak to Michael Reed directly? Linda shook her head. No, but Keller said he was acting on Reed's instructions. He said Reed had done deals like this before. He called it liability transfer strategy. Daniel almost smiled at that, but there was no humor in it. What made you run? Daniel asked. Linda started crying again, because the deal didn't go through. Keller called me the next morning and said I needed to leave the city for a while. He said people would start asking questions and I should not talk to anyone. Then I saw the news about the merger being delayed, and I knew something went wrong. I knew you found it. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Linda, look at me. She looked up slowly. You didn't run because you were afraid of me, Daniel said quietly. You ran because you were afraid of them. Linda's face went pale. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Agent Benson slid a document across the table. Linda, if you cooperate, if you give a full statement, if you testify about Keller and Reed and the money, the court will take that into account. But we need everything. Emails, phone calls, meetings, everything. Linda nodded quickly. I'll tell you everything. I don't want to go to prison for them. Daniel sat back and watched her for a long moment. 9 years she had worked for him. 9 years of schedules, meetings, flights, contracts, and for $200,000, she had almost destroyed everything he built. Linda, Daniel said quietly, there's one thing I want to know. She looked up, tears still in her eyes. When you changed that page, Daniel said, did you ever think about what would happen to my company if that deal went through? Linda started crying again. Keller said your company was strong, that you would recover, that rich people don't really lose everything. He said, it was just business. Daniel nodded slowly. It's never just business, he said. He stood up then, signaling the interview was over for him. Agent Benson stayed, continuing to take Linda's formal statement, but Daniel walked out into the hallway and stood there for a long moment, staring at the blank wall. Keller, the name on the business card. The man who came to the building asking about Annie. The man who paid Linda. The man who said he worked for Reed. Daniel pulled out his phone and called Martin. We have a name, Daniel said when Martin answered. Thomas Keller. He's Reed's middleman. He paid Linda, told her what to change, and told her to run. Martin's voice turned cold. Then we find Keller. Daniel nodded, even though Martin couldn't see him. Yes, because Keller is the bridge between Linda and Reed. And if we can prove Keller was acting for Reed, then Reed doesn't just lose money. He paused. He loses everything. As Daniel hung up the phone, he thought about Annie again. About a little girl sitting in a copy room reading a contract because she was bored and curious and liked big words. Linda had changed one page for money. Keller had planned the scheme for money. Reed had financed it for money. And the only person in this entire story who did anything for free was a 6-year-old girl who simply said, this contract has a problem. Daniel walked down the long federal hallway toward the exit, and for the first time since this began, he could see the end of the war. But he also knew something else. Men like Michael Reed did not surrender when they were losing. They did something desperate. On Wednesday morning, the story broke. It started as a small headline in the business section, the kind most people would normally skip. Merger between Carter Holdings and Reed Capital delayed amid internal review. By noon, the headline had changed. Federal investigation possible in failed billion-dollar merger. By evening, every major financial news channel was talking about Daniel Carter and Michael Reed. Inside his office, Daniel stood in front of the TV while the news played on mute. On the screen, a reporter stood outside the Carter Holdings building, speaking seriously into a microphone while a headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Sources close to the situation say the merger was halted after Carter Holdings discovered irregularities in the final contract. Federal authorities have not confirmed an investigation, but financial analysts say this could become one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in recent years. Martin muted the TV completely. Reed's stock dropped 8% today. Daniel didn't react. He'll try to stabilize it. Public statement. Confident tone. Say this is a misunderstanding. Martin nodded. You think he knows Linda is talking? He knows, Daniel said. Men like Reed always know when the walls start closing in. At that exact moment, Daniel's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered anyway. Daniel Carter. There was a pause on the other end. Then a calm male voice spoke. You've made this much bigger than it needed to be, Daniel. Daniel didn't need the caller to identify himself. He recognized the voice immediately. Michael Reed, Daniel said. Another short pause. Then Reed chuckled softly. I was wondering when you'd figure it out. Daniel walked to the window, looking out over the city. You altered a legal contract and tried to dump your liabilities onto my company. I'd say that's already big. Reed's voice remained calm, almost friendly. You're looking at this the wrong way. This was an opportunity. Your company is strong enough to absorb the liabilities. You would have survived, and the merger would have made you even richer in the long run. Daniel almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. You tried to sink my company and you're calling it an opportunity. It's business, Reed said. No one was supposed to get hurt. Daniel thought of Annie's photograph on his desk. You sent someone to take pictures of a 6-year-old girl. Reed was silent for a moment. Then he said, I don't know anything about that. Daniel's voice turned cold. Your man Keller went to my building asking for her name and school. Linda Harper says Keller works for you. The money that paid her traces back to your investment entity. You want to keep telling me you don't know anything? Reed sighed softly on the other end. You know what your problem is, Daniel. You're making this emotional. You're talking about right and wrong. Loyalty. Betrayal. Those are nice words, but they don't belong in boardrooms. No, Daniel said quietly. They belong in courtrooms. Reed's voice hardened slightly for the first time. If you take this to court, it won't just be me on trial. Your company will be audited from top to bottom. Every deal you've ever made, every tax structure, every offshore account your investors use. You really want that kind of attention? Daniel didn't hesitate. Yes. There was a long silence. Finally, Reed spoke again, his voice lower now. Then let me give you some advice. Drop this. Tell your board the deal fell apart over valuation differences. Fire the secretary. Blame a clerical error. We both walk away. You keep your company. I keep mine. No one else gets dragged into this. Daniel looked down at the street far below, cars moving like slow lines of light. And Annie? Daniel asked quietly. What happens to the little girl who noticed Clause 17? Reed didn't answer immediately. That girl, Reed said finally, is not your responsibility. Daniel's voice was very calm when he answered. She is now. Reed exhaled slowly. You're choosing a very expensive moral lesson. Daniel replied, You're the one who taught it. Another silence. Then Reed said, If you keep going, Daniel, you're going to lose a lot. Money, time, people you trust, maybe more. Daniel thought about his first office again, the cheap desk, the bad carpet, the years of building something from nothing. I can rebuild a company, Daniel said. I can't rebuild my name if I sign a contract I know was altered and pretend I didn't see it. Reed's voice turned cold. This isn't over. No, Daniel said. It isn't. Reed hung up. Daniel lowered the phone slowly and stood there for a long moment, staring out at the city. Martin spoke from behind him. That sounded like a threat. Daniel nodded slightly. It was. You still want to go forward? Martin asked. Daniel turned around. He tried to destroy my company. He paid my employee to commit a crime. And when that failed, he tried to scare a child. He paused. Yes, Daniel said. I want to go forward. That night, in the hotel room, Annie sat on the bed drawing a picture with colored pencils while her mother watched the news on low volume. On the TV, Daniel's building appeared on the screen again. They're talking about you, Annie said. I know, Laura said quietly. Are we famous? Annie asked. Laura almost smiled. Not the kind of famous people want to be. Annie looked down at her drawing. She had drawn a very tall building, a very small girl, and a big piece of paper in the girl's hands. Mom, Annie said, did I do something bad? Laura immediately walked over and sat beside her. No, baby, you did something right. But everyone is in trouble now, Annie said. Mr. Carter is in trouble. The people on TV are in trouble. You're scared. We're in a hotel. Laura pulled Annie into a hug. Sometimes, Laura said softly, doing the right thing doesn't make life easier. It just makes it right. Annie leaned her head against her mother and looked back at her drawing of the tall building and the small girl holding a piece of paper. She didn't understand contracts or mergers or liability, but she understood one thing very clearly. She had seen a sentence that wasn't fair, so she told the truth. And now the whole world was shaking because of one sentence and one little girl who refused to pretend it was normal. The arrest warrant was signed on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, everyone in Chicago's financial district knew something was happening. Federal agents arrived at the offices of Reed Capital just after 2 p.m. They did not rush. They did not speak loudly, and they did not answer questions. They walked through the glass lobby in dark suits, showed their badges to security, and went straight to the executive floor. People in offices stopped typing. Assistants stopped talking. Doors quietly closed halfway, leaving small gaps so people could see without being seen. Michael Reed was in his office when the agents walked in. He did not stand up immediately. He finished signing the document he was working on, capped his pen, and then looked up at the two agents in front of his desk. "Michael Reed?" one of them asked. Reed nodded once. "Yes. We have a federal warrant to search your offices and seize financial records and electronic devices related to an ongoing fraud investigation." Reed leaned back slightly in his chair and studied their faces. "This is about Daniel Carter. This is about document tampering, wire fraud, and conspiracy," the agent replied calmly. Reed gave a small smile. "Then you should talk to my lawyers." "You can call them," the agent said, "but we're executing the warrant now." For the first time, Reed's smile disappeared completely. Across the city, Daniel received the call from Agent Benson. "We're in his office," Benson said. "Servers, emails, financial records, we're taking everything." Daniel stood by the window. "Phone and Keller?" Daniel asked. "We picked him up this morning," Benson said. "He's already talking, not because he's loyal, because he's scared Reed will blame everything on him." Daniel nodded slowly. "He will. That's what Keller said," Benson replied. "He said Reed told him if anything went wrong, the secretary changed the document on her own. Keller just consulted, and Reed knew nothing." Daniel almost smiled. "Of course, but Keller kept records," Benson continued. "Emails, payment instructions. A voice message from Reed telling him to make sure Carter signs the version with full liability. That voice message is going to be very important in court." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. Not in relief, not yet, but in recognition that the truth was finally becoming something solid. Something that could not be erased by money or lawyers. "What happens now?" Daniel asked. "Now," Benson said, "we build the case, and then we take him to court." That evening, Daniel went to the hotel again. Annie was sitting at the small desk in the room, reading a book, her legs swinging slightly above the floor like they always did when she was thinking. Laura stood when Daniel walked in. "What happened?" Daniel looked at both of them, then said, "The federal agents searched Michael Reed's office today. They took his computers and his financial records. The man who paid Linda Keller has been arrested." Laura covered her mouth with her hand. "So it's over?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "Not yet. Now comes the court part." Annie looked up from her book. "Do I have to go to court?" Daniel walked over and sat in the chair across from her. "Maybe," he said honestly. "If the lawyers ask how we discovered the contract was changed, I have to tell the truth. And the truth is that you noticed Clause 17 was different." Annie thought about that. "Will I be in trouble?" "No," Daniel said gently. "You won't be in trouble. You'll just have to tell the judge exactly what you told me, that you read the contract the day before, and when you saw it again, one sentence was different." Annie nodded slowly. "That's easy. That's just the truth." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest when she said that, because for her, it really was that simple. "That's just the truth." Laura looked at Daniel. "What if Reed's lawyers try to say she's lying?" "They will," Daniel said. "They'll say she's a child, that she misunderstood, that she imagined it. They'll try to make her look confused." Annie frowned slightly. "But I'm not confused." "I know," Daniel said. "But court isn't always about what's true. Sometimes it's about what people can be convinced is true." Annie was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Will you be there?" "Yes," Daniel said. "I'll be right there." She nodded. "Okay. Then I'm not scared." Laura looked at her daughter, then at Daniel, and she understood something in that moment. Annie wasn't being brave because she understood fraud or contracts or federal court. She was being brave because she trusted the adults around her. Later that night, after Annie fell asleep, Laura and Daniel stood near the window, looking out at the river. "She's just a little girl," Laura said quietly. She should be worrying about spelling tests and cartoons, not courtrooms. Daniel nodded. I know. Laura looked at him. Why are you really doing this, Mr. Carter? You could have walked away. You're rich. You could have just canceled the deal and moved on with your life. Daniel was quiet for a long moment before answering. When I was 26, he said, I started my company with 3 employees and a folding table for a desk. For 2 years, I was so broke I slept in my office because I couldn't afford both rent and payroll. He looked out at the water, remembering. An older businessman helped me back then. He invested when no one else would. And one day I asked him why he trusted me when my company was so small. Laura listened quietly. He told me, I'm not investing in your company. I'm investing in your name. Companies can fail and be rebuilt. But once your name means nothing, you've got nothing left. Daniel looked back at Laura. If I let Reed get away with this, if I pretend it was just a mistake, then my company survives, but my name doesn't. And one day Annie grows up in a world where people like Reed always win because people like me decide it's easier to stay quiet. Laura looked down at the sleeping child on the bed. So this isn't just about money, she said. Daniel shook his head. No, it stopped being about money the moment a 6-year-old girl told me the truth and trusted me to do something about it. He looked at Annie for a long moment. I'm not going to teach her that telling the truth was a mistake, he said quietly. The courtroom was colder than Annie expected. Not cold like winter, but cold like a place where people didn't come to laugh or talk loudly. The walls were tall, the benches were hard, and everyone spoke in quiet voices like they were inside a library where the books were people's lives. Annie sat between her mother and Daniel Carter, her small shoes not touching the floor, her hands folded in her lap the way her teacher told her to sit when something was important. At the front of the room, the judge looked down from a high wooden bench. On one side sat the federal attorneys. On the other side sat Michael Reed and his lawyers, all in dark suits, all with serious faces. Reed looked different from the man Annie had seen once in the building lobby months ago. He didn't look powerful now. He looked angry. Not loud angry, quiet angry. The kind adults get when they are losing but still think they can win. Daniel leaned slightly toward Annie. Remember, he said quietly, just tell the truth. Only what you saw, nothing more. Annie nodded. I know. Her name was called. And Laura squeezed her hand gently before Annie walked to the witness stand. The chair was too big for her, and the court clerk had to adjust the microphone, so it was closer to her face. Can you tell us your name? The federal attorney asked gently. Annie Williams, she said. And how old are you, Annie? 6. The attorney smiled kindly. Do you know the difference between telling the truth and telling a lie? Annie nodded. Yes. The truth is what really happened. A lie is something that didn't happen. And do you promise to tell the truth today? Yes. The attorney walked slowly back toward the table. Annie, do you remember being in the copy room at Mr. Carter's office the day before the big meeting? Yes, Annie said. I was waiting for my mom. She cleans the offices. And did you see a contract on the table? Yes. It was in a blue folder. What did you do? I read it, Annie said simply. A few people in the courtroom smiled slightly at that. But the attorney just nodded. Why did you read it? Because I like reading big words, Annie said. And there were a lot of big words. A quiet ripple of soft laughter moved through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's look. Did you read a part called Clause 17? The attorney asked. Yes, Annie said. Because it had a lot of numbers and it talked about who has to pay if something goes wrong. And what did that part say when you read it the first time? Annie thought for a moment, making sure she said it right. It said both companies share the responsibility. That means both of them have to help fix the problem if something goes wrong. And did you see the contract again later? The attorney asked. Yes, the next day, Mr. Carter asked me to bring it to the conference room. And did Clause 17 look the same? Annie shook her head. No. It was different. What was different? The sentence said only Mr. Carter's company had to pay if something went wrong. The other company didn't have to pay. That's not sharing. The attorney nodded. How did you know it was different? Because I read it the day before, Annie said. And I remember sentences when they're not fair. The courtroom went very quiet at that. The attorney paused, then said, What did you do when you saw it was different? I told Mr. Carter, Annie said. I said, This contract has a problem. The attorney smiled slightly. Thank you, Annie. Then Reed's lawyer stood up and walked slowly toward the witness stand. He smiled, but it was a tight smile. Hello, Annie, he said. You said you like reading big words. Do you understand legal contracts? No, Annie said. So you don't understand most of the words in the contract, do you? I understand some, Annie said, and I understand when a sentence changes. The lawyer nodded slowly. But you're only 6 years old. Is it possible you just remembered it wrong? Annie shook her head. No. Is it possible, the lawyer continued, that you saw 2 different drafts, and they were supposed to be different? Annie thought about that, then she said, if they were supposed to be different, then why didn't anyone tell Mr. Carter they changed who has to pay? The lawyer opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. Annie continued, her small voice very clear in the quiet courtroom. If you change a rule so only one person gets in trouble, and you don't tell them, that's not a mistake. That's a trick. No one spoke. Even the judge was watching her very carefully now. The lawyer tried one more time. Annie, do you know what happens in big business deals? Annie shook her head. No. But I know what happens when someone changes a sentence so it's not fair anymore. The lawyer looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, no more questions. Annie stepped down from the witness stand and walked back to her seat. Laura hugged her tightly, and Daniel placed a hand gently on her shoulder. You did perfect, he said quietly. I just told the truth, Annie replied. Daniel nodded. I know. Across the courtroom, Michael Reed sat very still, his face expressionless, but his lawyers were no longer relaxed. They were whispering to each other quickly, flipping through documents, writing notes, because the most dangerous witness in the room had not been an expert in finance, or a corporate lawyer, or a forensic accountant. It had been a 6-year-old girl who understood one simple thing better than everyone else in the room. She understood when something wasn't fair, and she wasn't afraid to say it out loud. This story carries a simple but powerful lesson. Truth does not belong only to powerful people, educated people, or rich people. Sometimes, the person who sees the truth first is the one no one is paying attention to. Annie was just a 6-year-old girl, the daughter of a cleaning woman, invisible in a building full of executives, lawyers, and billion-dollar deals. But she was the only one who noticed that one sentence was not fair, and she had the courage to speak up. The story reminds us that integrity is not about status, money, or power. It is about what you do when you see something wrong. Daniel could have walked away and protected his company quietly, but he chose to protect his name and the child who told the truth. In the end, the story teaches that justice often begins with one small voice telling the truth, and one person in power choosing not to ignore it. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.